the bottom line here, I think, is that a regression is not a test of anything. It's an assumption of common method, it's an assumption of common impact. And therefore, what you have to do is consider the validity of the regression, applying the macro-commonality test, and applying the micro-commonality test, and ensuring that both of those tests are going to be passed by simply running the regression over and over again, and then looking at individual members of the proposed class and determining whether or not the behavior you observe for the price charged to those members is consistent with what you have found in your regression. And having done those two things, you can now have a sense of whether you have here a class or whether you have here a disparate group of individuals who need to be examined individually to determine whether or not they were impacted by the conspiracy, if the conspiracy is what you're thinking of.
Yeah, and I would say one other implication, which is the promise of a regression analysis, and I know the courts have struggled with this, is, in light of our paper, I think, yet more problematic, because you still have the questions that have been identified up till now, which are, can you get the data, will you get a valid result, et cetera. But until you actually have a regression, you can't do the kind of inquiries that Pierre has identified to figure out whether a regression that is valid and proves impact also proves common impact, whether it actually passes the macro and micro commonality tests. And now, on the other side, I'll just make it clear, a first regression that doesn't pass macro commonality, there may be some adjustments in the regression that would allow it to pass macro commonality.
An adjustment in the definition of the class. You may be able to...
Or in the specification of the regression. So a first failure is not necessarily the end, either an adjustment based on class definition or a respecification. But the point is, going back to the main implication, a promise of a regression is yet more problematic once you recognize the importance of this key distinction between proving impact and proving common impact.
Yeah, I mean, this should get all of us out of the problem of the battle of the experts. In other words, mathematics is pretty agnostic. It doesn't really care which side you're on. And here what we have is, I think, a set of tests which are objective tests, which I think most economists would agree are reasonable tests to marry the idea of the use of regression with the idea of common impact. And we can just let the data do the battling instead of having the expert do the battling.